Hi there. Thank you so much for joining today's presentation on communication tips presented by the Alzheimer's Society of Brant, Haldeman, Norfolk, Hamilton, Halton. My name is Olivia. I'm going to be today's facilitator. We'll be with you for maybe about the next half an hour or so. And thank you again so much for joining me today. So we'll get started. I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay. So let's pop this into presentation mode. There we are. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Just as a quick disclaimer, letting you know that this presentation is for educational purposes only. We are not offering any particular medical advice when it comes to caring for someone living with dementia. And again, of course, everyone's situation is different. Normally, we'd be having some people asking questions, I should say. But again, if you're watching this on YouTube, feel free to put some questions in the comments below, and hopefully someone or one of us from the organization will get back to you fairly promptly. Okay, so let's head into the presentation. So normally on this basis, we'd have a group of people joining us for today's presentation on a live basis. So normally what I would have them do is I'd have them open the chat box and type in what they believe this person is showing us in regards to her expression. Most of the time, the answers that I would get fall along the lines of happy, content, joyful, sort of all along the same basis. Now, if we go to the next slide here, we have this gentleman and he looks very different from the first picture. Of course, I'd ask the same thing, and the answers that I normally would get, so this man looks frustrated, upset, angry, etc., etc. So again, fairly much on the same basis. However, if we do it a third time, and we take a look at this picture, it's a little bit more confusing. We're not 100% sure of what this individual may be thinking or feeling. Some of the answers I've gotten are pensive, thoughtful, happy, content, sad. It's a little bit of a mixed bag. So that brings me to today's, again, topic, which is communication tips. And trust me when I say that communication tips or communication is more than what you say, but how you say it as well. And again, of course, that's my name on the screen. I'm Olivia. I'm a public education coordinator for the Alzheimer's Society of Brant, Haldeman, Norfolk, Hamilton, Halton. And again, thanks so much for joining. So we're going to jump into the meat and potatoes. Here we go. So the question we need to ask ourselves, first of all, what is communication and what does that actually mean in regards to breaking it down? So let's take a look at this, shall we? So we have a visual here of a weighted scale. Now, when we talk about communication, there are two different types. Most of us know this. The types are either verbal or nonverbal communication. So what that means is that, well, actually, let's break that down even farther, shall we? So let's look at the verbal side first. First of all, verbal communication is about what is said, so the words that physically come out of your mouth, the word choice that you use as well, and what those words mean. So that would be the definition of what you're saying. So that's it, pretty much it for the verbal side of communication. However, on the right-hand side of the scale, you can see that there's something called nonverbal communication. And it's not a mistake that the nonverbal is weighted much more heavily than that of the verbal communication. So let's look at some examples. First one that we saw in the activity earlier on is facial expressions. Our facial expressions say a lot about how we're feeling without us even really having to say anything at all. Next one is our gestures. So what we do with our hands, our body, our posture. When we wave, that's a very common gesture that a lot of individuals understand. Your tone of voice. So we're looking here at, again, what is the sound of your voice saying rather than just the words that you're actually saying. So for example, if you're saying to someone, hey, it's so good to see you, I hope you've been well, but you're saying it with a frown on your face and the tone of your voice is very deep and upsetting, then the words don't quite match the visual, which is something we'll be talking about later on in today's presentation. The next one is your eye movement. So with your eye movement, it makes a big difference when you're talking to someone and they make direct eye contact with you. Usually there's a better connection in regards to between person to person, and the whole conversation usually feels much more genuine as well. If you're talking to somebody and they're sort of dazing off into, into Neverland, then you might pick up on the fact that they're not quite as interested in what you have to say. And when we're talking about caring for someone living with dementia, then that can go a very long way. And again, something that we'll touch on a little bit later. The next one is touch. Now, again, please use your discretion when you use touch as a form of communication, making sure you have the person's consent and that they're okay with what you're doing. But even something as a simple, putting your hand on someone's arm just to comfort them and reassure them can go a very long way. They also say too that touch is another way to form a bond or connection with somebody. Especially when you're talking to them and you're having a conversation, if you can reach out and you put your hand on their shoulder, shake their hand, put your hand on their arm, whatever it is that they feel comfortable with, they're going to feel almost an instant deeper connection to you. So again, use this with your discretion, but know that, again, it's another form of nonverbal communication. The next one is the rhythm, sort of how fast or how slow you're talking to somebody. So if you're talking really, really fast and you really don't know what's going on, you might come off as nervous or not totally sure of what you're trying to say. Now, on the opposite side of the spectrum, if you're talking really, really slowly, this might come off as condescending or even talking down to someone if you're not careful. So again, especially when you're caring for a person living with dementia or even an older adult who may also have dementia, be conscious of these kind of things, because that's, again, where we start to look at building a relationship with the individual. Oops, excuse me. So again, just to go back to the weighted scale, obviously there's a good reason that nonverbal communication is weighted much more heavily than that of verbal communication. Now, for all my numbers people, the next slide here is for you. Again, if you like the visual in regards to talking about nonverbal versus verbal communication, I'm going to move my picture. I hope that wasn't blocking your view. Anyways, so we can see here in the pie chart breakdown, we're talking about what kind of communication there is. There's our words, our voice, and our body. Those are the three things that we have control over. And of course, our body takes over the biggest portion of the pie chart, to no surprise. Again, our gesture, our facial expressions. Then you have your voice, your rhythm, and your tone. And then a very small portion is just the words that you use. Okay, so I won't beat a dead horse here, but I hope we all get the idea of the breakdown of communication. Or not, I shouldn't say breakdown because that has a wrong connotation to it, but I think you get what I mean. Okay, so we'll hop on to the next slide here. So as a caregiver of someone living with dementia, first of all, when we're thinking about communication and thinking about yourself and your own communication, you have to identify what kind of approach works and is effective when you're talking to a person living with dementia. And of course, as a caregiver, and really for anybody for that fact, you really only have control over one person, and that is yourself. That's you. So again, you have control over your own words, your own actions and behaviors, but unfortunately, we don't have control over anybody else, even though it might be nice from time to time. So what we're talking about is the fact that, when you're talking to a person living with dementia, we can't control what they do, how they act, things that they say. However, sometimes by controlling our own behaviors and our own actions, we can actually influence their behaviors and actions. The reason for that being, when we're talking about a person living with dementia, a lot of the times a person living with dementia may mimic or mirror what they're seeing, what's in front of them, especially if they're communicating with another person. So if you have a smile on your face and your body is open and you seem friendly and approachable, and you're talking in a normal, soft tone, well, not soft, but a normal tone of voice, then there's a fairly good chance that the person that you're caring for, the person you're communicating with who has dementia, may very likely sort of mimic that reaction. Now, the same can be said for the opposite as well. So again, as caregivers, we have to be very cognizant of not only what we're saying with our words, but what the rest of us is saying to the person living with dementia as well. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. So for today's presentation, I want to talk about your communication toolbox and what you as a caregiver have immediate access to anywhere, anytime. There isn't a time where you can't use these 3 tools I'm going to be giving you. So like I said, there are 3, so we'll be going through each of them step by step. So here's the first one. So this is all about, the first communication tool I should say, it's all about validation therapy. So, excuse me for a second, so sorry. Sorry about that, everyone. Seem to be having some technical difficulties there. Okay, there we go. Try that again. Anyways, as I was saying, first communication tool is called validation therapy. So the woman that you see on the left side of your screen here, her name is Naomi Files, excuse me. And between the years of 1963 and 1980, she was the one who actually developed this therapy called validation therapy. And oddly enough, it was originally developed for older adults with cognitive impairments and not necessarily those actually living with dementia. It wasn't until later on that healthcare professionals started to realize the effectiveness that it had for caring for a person living with dementia. So again, that's sort of a quick little history. It's interesting to know that before validation therapy came into common use for caring for a person living with dementia, there was something called reality reorientation, something along those lines, where an individual living with dementia, especially those who are living in a long-term care home or a retirement home, were reminded on a daily basis of the things that they may normally forget. Because if we know that we're talking about someone with dementia, there's a very good chance that that person may experience short-term memory loss. So they might be reminded, this is today's date, this is the year we're living in, you live at this place, you no longer live in your old home. Oh, by the way, your husband is dead and he's been dead for 10 years. Hearing all of that, sort of first thing in the morning is quite shocking, especially for a person living with dementia, where that for them, it might feel like that's the first time they're hearing it. And again, that is most likely due to their short-term memory loss. So thankfully, that practice is no longer practiced in most care institutions. So what we did is then we replaced it with validation therapy. So here's a couple of things of what validation therapy is and what it isn't. So we'll go through the quick list there. So validation therapy is empathetic. It's jumping into the world of the person living with dementia, not expecting them, the person living with brain damage, to come into your world and reorientate to you. So it's empathetic, it's understanding. It is not ignoring or belittling someone and their needs, because we all have emotional needs, especially, different needs, but mostly the emotional ones we're talking about here. And that doesn't go away when you're diagnosed with dementia. It is absolutely very respectful to be able to validate what a person is feeling and what they're saying. It's not talking down to somebody and going, there, everything's okay, because maybe it's not okay. And we have to, again, validate that fact for that person. Usually when we're using validation therapy, we're matching someone's emotions. So if we understand that they're upset or they're perturbed about something, then we're not going to come in all, jazz hands and smiles, because they're going to say, hey, you're not hearing me, you're not listening to me. Why don't you understand what I'm feeling right now? So if you can, again, use your nonverbal communication and match their emotions based on your words and your expressions, that's going to get you a lot farther as well. It's absolutely a very personal, it's not impersonal by any means. And like I said, it's emotionally based rather than fact-based. Sometimes caregivers may have a tendency to, again, reorientate the person. Mom, I just told you that 5 minutes ago. No, Mom, your doctor's appointment is tomorrow. It's not today. Sort of working on our world versus the world of the person living with dementia. Because again, as a person progresses through their journey with dementia, again, their brain may become, usually does, I should say, become more and more damaged over time, which means that their world might not totally match ours. But again, that's the job of the caregiver to be able to step into that world. I think I've covered everything. Oh, you know what I should do is give you an example. That's what I ought to do. So when we're talking about validation therapy, I'll give you a quick example. So let's say you're talking to your dad, and your dad is kind of saying that, he really misses his old job. He's been retired for a little while now, but, he says, oh, I used to love, working down at Stelco, because I'm a Hamilton girl, what can I say? I used to love working down at Stelco, he'd say, and I wonder how everybody's doing. And again, as a caregiver, you might come in and say, you know what, I really get that. I had this old job once too, and I had so many good friends there, so I can understand what you're feeling. And really, that's it. That's an example of validation therapy. It's just showing the individual that you get what they're saying. You get where they're coming from. So that's the first tool. And the next two tools you'll actually be able to use in conjunction. So you'll be able to use all three together. And we'll talk about how we do that in a few more slides. So the second tool we have is something called therapeutic fibbing. Now, I want to be very clear that therapeutic fibbing is not the same thing as lying, because when we lie to a person, we know that that is wrong and immoral. However, when we use therapeutic fibbing, we're bending the truth in a way that is not unnecessarily hurtful. Again, because if mom is asking me, have you seen your dad? Do you know where he is? But we know that dad hasn't been around for many years now. Well, we don't want to go and say to mom, Mom, don't you remember dad died 10 years ago? Again, that's shocking and that can be hurtful. And that might not be totally necessary in the moment. Again, trying to reorientate someone. So let's look more at this. When we use something like therapeutic fibbing, we're letting the person have their dementia. Like I said before, we're stepping into their world rather than expecting them to step into ours, because we're the ones with the healthy brains. And the person living with dementia is the one that has a damaged brain. It's about kindness. Again, not hurting or upsetting someone unnecessarily. Therapeutic fibbing is a form of kindness. And of course, we shouldn't be using it to manipulate someone or, take advantage of them. But if we can use therapeutic fibbing to help someone get through their day and have an overall better quality of life, then absolutely, please do so. And please also know that it won't fix their dementia. It won't cure them in any kind of way, because right now there is no cure for dementia. But again, what you're doing is you're offering a better quality of life for this person that you're caring for. So a quick example of what therapeutic fibbing might look like. Okay, here we go. Let's say mom is asking for her red sweater, and this is her favorite sweater, but you know that about a couple of years ago, you were able to donate it to the Amity, let's say, and so that red sweater is no longer around. So mom says, hey, have you seen my red sweater lately? I'm kind of chilly, I really like it. And you would say to mom, mom, I haven't seen it in a while either. Well, you know what? Why don't you go sit here and I'll make you a cup of tea if you're getting chilly, and I'll grab you another sweater, don't worry. Again, there we're saying that I haven't seen it in a while, which is not a lie because we haven't, but we're not saying something like, oh, it's just in the laundry, because we know it's not in the laundry. We're not going to say that if it's not true. And that sort of example, jumping in, that sort of example will lead me into the next tool, but I'll touch on this last point here. And this is the fact that by doing this, you're building a relationship with the person. You're building a trust and a bond between you that when you're caring for someone living with dementia, it can go a very, very long way. The person living with dementia will hopefully feel more trusting towards you and allow you to be part of their life. And hopefully, if you were to ever assist them with anything, you may have more favorable outcomes as well. So like I said, that sweater example leads me into the third tool, which is something called redirection. So when I said something like, Mom, would you like a cup of tea if you're chilly? Again, first of all, I should go back to step one and say, now we're validating Mom, but you know what? I haven't seen that sweater either, and I know you really love it, but you said that you're chilly, so let's make you a cup of tea. So now we've sat Mom down, we're getting the tea ready, and we're asking her, do you want milk or sugar in it? And now, again, we're being able to redirect Mom into another topic of conversation or another activity altogether. So one thing that redirection is it's not ignoring someone's needs or what they're saying. Because sometimes, as caregivers, we like to jump right to step 3 and forget steps 1 and 2. So we like to forget the validation and the therapeutic fibbing. We just jump to redirection. So Mom might say something of, have you seen my wallet? I don't know where it is. And you say, don't worry, everything's fine. They're there. You know, that's kind of brushing somebody off. And we don't want to do that because that's not showing the respect, of course, that the person absolutely deserves. So again, we're not ignoring someone's needs because we always use step 1 and 2 first, but then we'll hop into redirection. And again, this allows them to have their dementia so that we're not, letting them, drag on and on about the same topic and then unnecessarily upsetting themselves either. We don't want them to belabor a point for too long. Like I said, this is sort of a coping mechanism for caregivers that they're there, everything's fine. We want to try and stay away from that as much as we can, showing that we actually are listening and we do care about what the person living with dementia has to say. Like I said, it's not the first tool to use. We want to use tool 1 and tool 2 before we jump to number 3. Oops. So that is the whole toolbox. It seems kind of quick because I have no one to bounce any questions off of. But like I said, if you've got questions, leave them in the comment box. We'll be happy to answer them. Now, so again, for the toolbox, like I mentioned, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a moment. You want to use all 3 tools in conjunction with one another rather than just picking and choosing which one will work. Because, for example, if I validate somebody, but I leave it at that and I don't go to redirection, then the person living with dementia might start asking me again and again and again. But if I can redirect them and change the topic of conversation, or have their attention focused on something else, then we're going to hopefully avoid them again belaboring that same point over and over. Now, of course, 5-10 minutes, even an hour later, they might ask me the same question. And it's sort of the role of caregivers to have that patience and, you start all over again. Go back to tool number 1, go back to the validation, then use a therapeutic fibbing if you have to, and then move into redirection. Now, that tool number 2, the therapeutic fibbing, not always necessary. So again, use your discretion. Sometimes it can just be validating and redirecting, because really, as human beings, we just want to be heard. We just want to know that people get us and they get that they get where we're coming from. That doesn't stop too when we're diagnosed with dementia. Okay. So the question is, if we look at the flip side, so we've talked about how a caregiver communicates, but let's talk about how a person living with dementia communicates as well. So sometimes, as an individual living with dementia progresses through their journey, their verbal communication skills might become more challenging for them to use effectively and efficiently. So even if they're saying something to you and it doesn't make sense verbally speaking, think about the nonverbal side of things. Think about their cueing, their body language, their facial expressions, their tone of voice. From that, you'll most likely be able to pick up on how they're feeling and maybe what they're trying to tell you, excuse me. So again, as time progresses as well, and that is the person living with dementia, PLWD, as time progresses and they progress through their journey with dementia, they're going to rely much more heavily on the nonverbal communication that you can offer to them and that their world is giving them as well. So what we mean by that is that as the brain becomes more and more damaged and the brain has a harder time interpreting verbal communication, the brain is going to heavily rely on the nonverbal communication. So what is the world around me telling me? What are the people around me telling me? A lot of the times we say that a person living with dementia usually sees first and hears second, meaning that what they see processes usually a little bit quicker than what they hear. So again, as a caregiver, making sure that what they see, which is you, is a positive thing, then again, you're going to hopefully have more favorable outcomes. So there you go, I jumped ahead of myself. I tend to do that sometimes. And when we're talking about the behavior, or excuse me, the communication of a person living with dementia, we have to look at their behavior as well, because every behavior has a meaning behind it. Now, sometimes those behaviors are easy to decipher. For example, if someone's eating, it usually means they're hungry. That might be bored or whatever, but most of the time, if you see that a person is eating something, that usually means they're hungry. That's a pretty easy one to decipher. However, there are some behaviors that are more commonly associated with dementia. For example, someone might be having more sleep disturbances during nighttime. And again, it's our job as caregivers to put our detective hats on and figure out what is it they're trying to tell me through their nonverbal communication. Because again, sometimes as dementia progresses, the verbal might not make as much sense. So we have to look at the nonverbal side of things too. Oops, excuse me, sorry, I jumped ahead of myself again. So again, when we're talking about the fact that behavior has meaning, sometimes a person living with dementia may exhibit what we call a responsive behavior. So I don't want to dive too deep into responsive behavior today because that's a whole other presentation on its own. But what a responsive behavior is that a person living with dementia, or any person at all, because we're all capable of showing responsive behaviors, behaves in a certain way in response to something that has happened to them, either an external stimuli or something they're feeling internally. Because if we look at something called the triad of brain function, which I recommend you can go on YouTube or Google and do some little research on that. There's three things that make up the function of our brain. That is our emotions, our behaviors, and our cognition. When we talk about cognition, that's our thinking, our behaviors are our actions, and our emotions are our feelings. And those three things constantly interact with one another and affect one another. Mind you, as a person living with dementia, as they progress through their journey, their cognition is going to be slightly hindered over time, more and more usually as time progresses. So what they're normally left with to rely on is their emotions and behaviors. So when we're talking about cognition, sort of like your mental filter, I want to say something, but I know I shouldn't say it because it might get me in trouble. That's sort of your mental filter at work. However, for a person living with dementia, that mental filter might start to break down over time. So they might start to be, saying or behaving in a certain way that doesn't quite make sense to us or doesn't make sense to the context of our environment. But again, not to dive too deep into that, that's the role of the caregiver to be able to say, this behavior is, off of the person's baseline. It's not their usual normal. So what are they trying to tell me with that? Okay, so that pretty much wraps up everything for today. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this long, congratulations. Please leave any questions you have in the comments, and someone will be sure to get back to you. If you have any questions that are a bit more specifically based on your situation as a caregiver, what you can do is you can contact your local public education coordinator, and we'll set up something called a Zoom Q&A. So that's through Zoom Communications, and we do a Q&A session just based on the questions that are sent to us. So if you're in Hamilton, you can send an email to me. My name is Olivia. The email address is out there on the screen. If you're from the Halton area, talk to Danielle. If you're in Brantford, talk to Lori. And if you're from the Haldimand Norfolk area, you can talk to Susan. And again, just send us your situation-based questions if you've got a really deep burning question about dementia or about the person you're caring for, whatever it might be. And we'll do our absolute best to be able to answer that and give you some more insight, hopefully. So thank you so much again for joining us. Please remember to check out our website for any information about upcoming online education while we're still in the pandemic of COVID-19. Our website is www.alzhn.ca. You can kind of see it at the end of our emails there, but that's www.alzhn.ca. And you can find out all the information you need to about the Alzheimer's Society. All right, well, thank you so much. I hope you all are well, and thanks again, everyone.